Fosse Verdon earned 17 Emmy nominations, including one for production designer Alex DiGerlando, who joins me here. I'm Tony Ruiz with Gold Derby. And Alex, so this is such a period piece in the best sense of the word period piece. So when you're looking at something that's this specific to the world of Hollywood of a certain age and the theater of a certain time period, where do you start?
Well, in the case of this, it's two layers of period, like you just alluded to. It's the time, but then it's also these well-established historical documents, these films and plays that are beloved. So, it's a two-prong approach. We have to kind of get all the period details right to make sure that the environments that the characters are inhabiting feel appropriate to the time period. But then we have to build these sets or recreations of sets. And it's not just about getting them to look right, which ends up being kind of more complicated than you would think at first glance, but also to think about how these sets would have been constructed at the time. So when we build a set now, we have certain, methods and materials that are our kind of go-tos that weren't available at the time that some of these sets were made. So we have to kind of get in that mindset so that we're making a true replica rather than representation. I guess that's the word I'm looking for. So it doesn't just resemble the set; it sort of is the set as it would have been at that time.
And it's interesting that you say that, because not only are you creating, I'm thinking specifically of particularly some of the film sets that you have to recreate, like with Cabaret and Sweet Charity and those sorts of things. So you have to recreate those sets, but then you also have to create them in a different way so that, it's also a film set, a working film set that's being shot. So what are the specific approaches that you take in terms of how do you make it practical so that it looks period, but then can also be filmed for a contemporary audience?
Well, yeah, I don't think there's anything that we did so differently in the sense of what makes it practical to shoot, because like a wild wall, wild being, our jargon for a movable wall, that hasn't changed so much. But I guess a good, to get into kind of like a good answer to your question is like, so the sound stages that exist now look very different than sound stages in, the 60s and 70s. So even though we had a lot of scenes that took place on sound stages, we were limited in how much we could see the volume of the stage itself, because while there was one in Long Island, Grumman stages that passed pretty well for a period soundstage, Silver Cup North, which is where we shot the bulk of the show, it really is a much more state-of-the-art facility and wouldn't have been appropriate. So when we were doing, for instance, the scenes from All That Jazz, where Lynn playing Roy Scheider, playing Bob or Joe Gideon is dancing with his daughter in the rehearsal studio. We had to think about how we were going to have the walls be wild so that when we shot the coverage of the scene as it appeared in the movie, that's one thing. But then we also had to think about how, like when we're shooting the coverage of the people filming the coverage, and when we see off the set onto what would be the sound stage, we had to really think about where we're placing what looked like other sets or the backs of other sets to mask the more contemporary looking soundstage, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that was a little bit of a puzzle.
Well, and you're not only creating these performance spaces in these film sets, but then you also have, conversely, these home sets, like the beach house in the 5th episode, Gwen and Bob's apartment. So I guess one of the things that I always find curious is how early in the process do you start with your research, and where do you go? What does that process entail for you?
Well, it varies from project to project. I mean, this show didn't have a very long prep time. We kind of had a air date, so we were sort of backed into that and kind of hit the ground running. But definitely, research was the very first. It's always my way into any set I'm designing. So as soon as I got the job, I started digging into what Bob and Gwen's apartment might have looked like. It was a little tricky because there's not that much online that shows the apartment. I was able to, from reading the biography, I was able to figure out what their address was. It was 91 Central Park West. And I knew that they lived in the penthouse. And it just so happened that at the time I was starting that penthouse apartment, or maybe the neighboring penthouse apartment, was for sale. So there were actually an abundance of real estate photographs that kind of gave me a window into at least the architecture of the space. And it's a really kind of spectacular apartment, rumored to have been built by William Randolph Hearst, although that's maybe a slightly contested rumor, but we like to believe it. It makes a good story.
We'll go with it. That's fine.
But so all that, like the details of like the stained glass and the linen fold paneling and the fireplace and all that kind of stuff, we had actually really good reference for, so we could kind of start, designing the space off of that. And then once Nicole Fosse kind of came into the fold, and and that was like a super amazing resource to have, a character. She's not a character; she's a character in the show, but she's a real person who lived there, giving us family photos that no one outside of the family had ever seen before, and those photos, filled in the gaps. Like, I never would have ever thought to cover the walls in crushed orange velvet, but it was there in the photos. And those really beautiful floral patterned sofa, and lots of plants, and the kind of medieval artwork. All of those things were things that that's not what I would have guessed. And there was like a half a second where, when Tommy and I were talking about how we wanted to, represent their apartment, we were like, well, should we embellish it a little bit, or should we change it to be more showbiz? And we're like, but this is real, and what's better than that? And like, we have this great opportunity to give the audience a window into the reality of what, we all have a perception of what a showbiz star's life is, but that's the reality of it is very different. So part of what we got really excited about is showing the reality of that. And like one example of that is they have a very, very well appointed apartment. It's very beautiful in an amazing location with amazing details, but the kitchen is very modest. And in this day and age, a high-end apartment would have a very opulent kitchen, but back when that apartment was built, before Bob and Gwen even lived there, that was built by a person for a person who had never stepped foot into a kitchen. And so, we gave them a kitchen that was right for the period, which was, basically a little bit more than a galley kitchen. And it just so happened that Bob and Gwen really love to cook. So a lot of the show takes place in that space. So anyway, it's like details like that we really got excited about. And then dealing with the contrast of Bob's apartment when he leaves 91 Central Park West and moves to 58 West 58th Street into a pretty plain, run-of-the-mill condominium with white walls. All the details of the dressing from that came from Nicole's photos as well. And all of those neon signs are replicas of the actual neon signs that he had in his apartment. We were even able to find pieces of furniture that were the exact furniture that he had. So we really kind of, took it to the extreme of not editorializing to really, create a very true to reality representation. And you mentioned the beach house, which is kind of an interesting, that's a little different because they had several different beach houses through the years. And we had a couple of photos that we were able to find online of the Quogue beach house that Bob rented after he and Gwen split, but they didn't show much detail. So knowing where the house was, we looked for houses that looked similar to the little bit of details that we could see in the photos, and used those as reference. That's a completely built set. So all the views you see out the window of the beach and everything, the dune we built with the grasses, but beyond that, the water, that's all digitally added in post. And it's funny, after the show came out, some people who knew the Fosses or grew up in going to the beach in that area saw the set and were like, oh, I remember being in that house. And really, that house was a complete fiction, and one of the rare sets in the show that we really relied on our imagination for completely. But in designing that set was different than some of the others, because that episode and that entire episode 5 takes place in that beach house set, and it really was written sort of like a play, kind of like a chamber piece, like a cat on a hot tin roof. So we really had to, and Tommy wanted to cover those scenes sort of in the way Robert Altman would have, with uninterrupted takes and following cast as they moved from one room to another. So we had to really approach the space in such a way that would accommodate that, which is easier said than done, because some scenes characters need privacy. You can't feel like other characters could be listening to them or within earshot. But then for other scenes, you want the kind of open plan feel so that they're flowing from one part of the space into another. So there was a little bit of some math kind of to figure out how to scratch all those itches.
Well, and it's funny, you were talking about how Gwen's apartment, you never would have imagined it looking a specific way. So when you don't have, when you don't have those specific reference points, like when you don't have Nicole Fosse's input about this is what it looked like, how is it all something you picture in your mind? Is it something you look at in terms of the time period? Where do you think your ideas come from?
They come from all sorts of different directions and kind of bombard you, and then they kind of gel into something. So yeah, part of it is kind of looking at what the trends of the time were, and that kind of can get you so far. And then you look at, the character, what's written on the page. In this case, these characters are based on real people. So even if we didn't have the exact reference, we know a lot about them and the way they live their lives. So there are clues in that, and then there's sort of the kind of the mechanics of the story. Like, what does the set, the set has to serve a lot of functions. It has to be shot, and the director and a DP will have very specific ideas of how they want to shoot. So I can't build a wall in such a way that's going to prevent them to get a certain kind of coverage that they need. So, there are a lot of meetings where we're sort of hashing through the scenes to just make sure that everything is positioned in such a way that allows all of that work to happen. And then there's also sort of the kind of, minute detail work of what the actors are doing and how they're conveying the characters through action and interaction with the set. So a lot of the dressing comes out of that, and what the script tells us the character would do. So, I approach all of these things from the story and character vantage point. I like to think of designing a set for a specific character in terms of like, I guess the best way to put it is like as opposed to the way an architect designs a space. I mean, they're designing a space for a specific person or a specific company or a specific kind of person, right? But they're designing it for everything that's yet to come. But in a movie or a TV show, we're designing for all of that, but we're also designing for what has come so far before the story has started. So a lot of times we're building in ideas into the set that show how the space evolved through the years. Sometimes you see that on camera. In the case of this, I think it's episode 7 or 8, you flash back to when Bob and Gwen first moved into the apartment and they're trying to have a baby. And so you see what the apartment looked like before the orange crushed velvet was on the walls and before all the furniture that we've been living with all this time is there. So that's like one example of where you see it on camera. But in other ways, sometimes we're doing kind of funky architectural things where, I can't think of an exact example where it happens in this show, but sometimes this happened a lot in True Detective where like we would add something that was that felt like wrong, like that shouldn't be there, to tell the story that like someone who lived in the space before the person who's living there now did some kind of renovation and did it in a weird way. And that sort of fleshes out the story of the space, if that makes any sense. So there are so many different angles that you can come at conceiving of a space from that will sort of enrich the overall story you're telling. And anyway, I guess that's the best way of explaining it.
No, that's as good as an explanation as I can think of. Alex, congratulations on the Emmy nomination. Best of luck. Everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the Emmys, and we'll have more chats throughout the season. Alex, congratulations. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Tony.